Hi, Roger Vitko here with Tunze Tech Tips. This is our third episode. Today I'm going to cover the Nano Osmolator 3152. It's a fairly simple product designed for new hobbyists or in smaller reef tanks. But you know, it's one of those things that there's a lot of user error and small issues and troubleshooting that we can cover. And let's get started. So probably the most important thing to note with this product is that your main switch is a float switch and your safety is a timer inside the controller. So once the switch goes down and the pump starts, you have a time delay of 1 minute and 40 seconds that it has to fill the tank within. If it takes longer than that, the safety timer kicks the system off, the pump twitches every 10 seconds, and it's going to keep doing that indefinitely and never top off your tank again until you reset it. That factory setting is only for a system under 26 gallons. So if you have a larger system, you need to open the controller, and you do that by squeezing in these two tabs. Once you got the controller open, you can see here above the relay there's a jumper. If we pull this jumper off, now we have 2 pins, and we put it on 1 pin. Now we have a 2 minute and 45 second time delay. So that's suitable for a tank 26 to 55 gallons. The thing to keep in mind with this time limit is that it's a fail-safe in case the float were to ever stick or fail. It would not flood your aquarium, so it's a very important safety. But it also is what limits these to small tanks. You can't put this on a larger tank and expect it to keep up. And I see a lot of people try, they'll put it on they'll have a 75 and say, well, my sump's only 25 gallons. That doesn't quite work. You've got the evaporation of the whole system, and that short time limit limits it to adding about 1/4 to 1.5 quarts before it times out. The long time limit gives you about 2.5, maybe 3 quarts before it shuts down. And you have to unplug it and plug it back in to manually reset the system. So generally, we had the controller open here, and I wanted to explain some of the things that tend to go wrong. Every now and again I get a complaint about how it just keeps running and running. Every incidence like that I've ever seen, what has happened is that water followed the float switch wire in or came in on the power supply tip that was plugged in wet. And sometimes I see that these are just left on the floor and inside the cabinet. And if you do that and it gets wet, well, that'll directly short on this relay, and then there's nothing to stop it. So you've got to be careful with water around this. It's not waterproof. It is an electronic device. We'll move on to covering how to check a few other system issues. Okay, so let's say you have a nano osmolator that does not turn on. So, in general, we have our float switch mounted in the aquarium, cable comes out the top, this is the correct orientation. If it is not turning on the pump when it's dropped down and we have no twitching, you want to check first that the pump's if it's twitching every 10 seconds, that's our indicator that it timed out. So if it's not that, what we want to do is troubleshoot step by step through the system. One of the first things you can do is check the pump. Typically, if a pump's bad, it causes an overload, which causes the controller to shut down. Usually in those cases, if you cycle the power, the pump will run and it may not run in the sense of pumping water or any real activity, but you'll hear a hum or see a twitch. It may run for a fraction of a second up to usually under 30 seconds, and then it'll stop. And that's because your pump is using too much power and the controller shut it down as a safety. One thing we can do to test a pump is very simple. You just take a 9-volt battery, touch the terminals to it, you can hear the pump running. If that checks out and we know we have a good pump, the next thing you can do is check the power. Moving on from the pump, the pump is probably, if I had a unit that wasn't adding water, that would be my #1 thing to check. Another thing to always check with the pump is air will get stuck in here and it will be unable to prime. If this pump's ever been out of water, you'll need to tip it upside down while it's submerged to get the air bubbles out. This is reason #1 to not use a jug as your water reservoir. Use a bucket. Even though this fits, being able to access the pump goes a long way to solving problems with the pump. You also want to be able to check this fitting. This fitting, it's not that often of an issue, but they do sometimes crack. Usually if they crack, that was some latent shipping damage or damage in our handling at the factory or in shipping to us. But these fittings, if they crack, you'll lose pressure. Unfortunately, this fitting isn't available as a spare part. If you do have a cracked one, we do our best to try to accommodate you. We sometimes have used ones from pumps that quit working, but they're made when they make the pump, and there's only one made for each pump, so it's not an available spare part. Another thing you can always do is the pumps last 2 to 3 years. You will need a replacement at some point, so you could buy a replacement pump and then just borrow the fitting and use it for the life of both pumps. But moving on to the next thing to check is our power supply. Of course, the best method to check the power supply would be a voltmeter. I know not everyone has one. I strongly suggest owning a voltmeter and owning a good one. They're incredibly useful for changing circuit breakers, fixing an outlet on your house, basic car repairs. It really is something I think most people should have, and it's worth owning a good one because the cheap ones don't tend to work very reliably, and I've had them just start smoking and do crazy things. You never have that happen with a fluke meter. So we have our setting to DC voltage. The hole in the middle, it's a tip positive connection, so that's the inner tip. The outer shell is the negative. You can see we get a reading of about 12.15 volts. Typically the voltage will be in the range of 12 to 13.5 volts. It does vary somewhat with the input voltage, but as long as we're in the ballpark, it should be fine. If we have voltage, we know the power supply is good. Power supply failure is actually really rare. Usually the only way the power supply fails, you can look in this tip, and if it landed in water, that'll be all green inside and it's all corroded and no longer makes contact, and then you need a new power supply. That's about the only failure I ever see. We do rarely see one that if it dropped or was in shipping and handling, it got bounced around. Sometimes one of the contacts, especially there's a fuse in there, that can break and it just won't work, but it's not a very common thing. If we don't have a voltmeter, here's plan B to test the power supply. We know our pump works from the previous battery test. We touch one wire to the inner tip, one wire to the outside. The pump's running, so we know we have power. So we've narrowed down both of these causes if we didn't have an operation. So now we move on to the controller. As far as our controller goes, the primary thing that triggers operation is the float switch. And the float switch is a magnetic switch. This black ring in here is a magnet. And when it moves up and down, it's flipping a little reed switch in the post. And then that actuates a relay in here, which is also a magnetic switch. So one of the main causes of failures is magnetic interference issues. The magnet mounts are designed to cancel out if they exactly shadow each other. You cannot have this magnet holder overlapping to where, you know, this much of it's sticking up above the glass pane because there's no glass in between it to cancel it. You also can't have them angled to where they're hanging on the trim of a tank. They need to be flat, and they need to be positioned to where all of the magnet holder is on a glass pane. And that pane needs to be at least 3/16 of an inch thick. If it's thinner than that, you want to add a shim, and it's very important that they're lined up correctly. Both halves have these slots in them, and you can use those slots to make sure that they are lined up to where they exactly shadow each other. And it is entirely possible to put these in such a way that they're only half lined up, especially on very thin glass. Without them being lined up properly, the magnetic fields are not canceled, and they will affect the float switch. And you will actually be able to see that. You can see here that when I bring the magnet near the float, I can make the float lean, I can make it sit crooked, and it's not going to work in this circumstance. So if you see that the bobber is leaning, or the bobber is pulled, or that it's acting in any way odd and not just sitting straight up and down, then check your magnets. You can add a, if you want to make a test, what I always tell people to do is take the outside magnet away, take the inside magnet with the sensor housing on it, and just hold these pieces and cycle them up and down. If it then works, well, then we know it's got to be the magnet. Another thing, you can't have another magnet within a few inches because that can also affect it. And don't mix these magnets up. From our production, if you're using other Tunze products, what makes the magnets for the Nano Osmolator unique, they're gray. A lot of our other magnets are either dark or gray, or they're almost a black color, or they're a steel blue color. And then both halves have the black ring on them. Most of our other magnets, one has a blue ring, one has a black ring. So there is a cosmetic difference, and don't take the magnets from another product. If you lose one, you can buy these replacement magnets. They do only come as a pair, so I would strongly advise not losing them because it's about a $25 pair of magnets. Then as far as another thing we can check with the float switch, we can test it internally if we have a float switch error, and we'll get to that next. The float switch is the next thing we should check if we had a system failure, and the float switch can be tested rather easily. If we have a multimeter, we can switch to ohms, and when the float switch is up, as the water would be shut off, we should measure about 0.5 ohms. When it's down, we would measure infinite ohms. It would be as if it was not passing electricity at all. If we didn't have a multimeter, there's another way to check if it's probably the float switch. And that is to take our controller, and I should probably cover this while we're here. A lot of people ask me, how do you connect and disconnect the pump? You squeeze these clips, insert the wire, let go. And releasing them is the same way, just squeeze and pull the wire out. But we connect our pump so that we've got something that'll kick on and tell us that it's running. Then we connect our power. Now the pump's running. We have the float switch unplugged. If I short out these two pins, if the controller works and it's just the float switch, the pump will stop. So I just take a paper clip, short out the two pins. It's a little tricky to do this on camera, especially with this goofy paper clip I picked up off my desk. But we stop the unit. So then we know that our controller's good. We've already checked that our pump's good, our power supply is good. So then we know it has to be the float switch, and the float switch is a part you can order. They're not terribly expensive. But float switch failure is generally fairly rare. It is a switch, it does wear out. Usually they're going to last 4+ years. It's going to depend how often it's cycled on and off. So it is a possibility that the float fails. It's just not something really common. So the last thing we can check is for water damage. We've unplugged the float switch. Now you can clearly see these 2 pins. That's a prime area to check, especially if you have a continuous run on. When that's shorted out, the unit will run and run and run, but it's actually not shorted out, but you'll have corrosion in there to where you have no contact, so you're simulating that infinite ohms. But if that's the case, then you'll see that when you unplug. You'll see that there's corrosion there, and then the only thing that'll stop it is a safety timer, because the relay and the other systems are still functional. If the water damage comes in from the power supply or is more severe, like the whole controller got wet, a lot of times nothing will stop it because that relay is directly shorted on, and that's really about the only cause I know of where they just keep running and running and nothing shuts it off. But just to check it, there's actually one little screw there. Undo the one screw, we can get the board out and just give it a good look over for any corrosion. If you don't see anything, well, then that's probably not it. It's fairly rare that the board fails outside of water damage, but it is possible. This circuit board also has firmware on it. Next, I'll show you, diagnostic tools we have here to check these. So here, this is just showing the diagnostic tool we use here. I mean, this isn't really of much interest as far as do it yourself. Just wanted to show that we can check these if, it's rare that there's a firmware problem or much anything that needs to be done on this end, but occasionally you see a unit that either was misprogrammed from the factory, which doesn't happen very often, or it can be that there was a big power surge, wrong power supply connected, and the firmware gets wiped out. And we can reset that and adjust that here. So that is something to just keep in mind. A lot of people think this is a very simple device. It's just a relay in a box, but there's a little more to it, and we can connect to them and get some basic diagnostics off of it. I wanted to cover a few things, and I kind of have to laugh. I look at myself in the camera, and I got this like cowlick on the back of my head, and this is flannel shirt number 3 in one of these videos. But honestly, I make these videos to try to help the customers and try to help myself. I don't know that a lot of people realize this, but I'm pretty much it. I have some part-time help here. I pack all the orders, I do all the repairs, and I make these in the little bits of time I get. They're not scripted. It's just, hey, this is something that needs to be talked about so that maybe people can help themselves. It'll lighten my workload a little. Instead of having all these emails, I can send people a video, and it covers everything way more than I could just in trying to compose an email and move on to the next task. But I wanted to point out that inside every box is this warranty manual, and all my contact info is right here on the cover. The email, the phone number, the address to ship it to. We did move last year, so make sure you have that 2121 Coal Springs address, not the old address in Austin. But this is important. Keep this. It's how to contact me if you do need help. The other thing I wanted to point out is that all of our product manuals have the spare parts info and spare parts breakdown. And so you can use these spare parts, you can use the manual to, here's all the parts numbers, here's the illustration, you follow it over here, then you get your part number. All our part numbers are in that 7-digit format, 4 digits, a decimal, and 3 more. You can go to tunze.com, you can order those parts, and you can keep the product running for a lot longer. And also, this comes up now and again, but all of our products have a serial number tag on the cord. Do not cut off those tags. That is your warranty. Instead of having, a card you mail in and paperwork that makes headaches for both of us, it's just that tag. If you cut that tag off and throw it away, that voids the warranty. You've got to keep that tag on the product, or at least if you got some sort of OCD twitch and just have to cut it off, well, file it away somewhere, keep it, because it is critical to the warranty. That's how we know when it was made. That's how we know everything about the product and that production run and what may or may not have been an issue. And we keep track of that so that if we find an issue, hey, all these from this week of production were messed up, well, we can get on the guy that messed them up and we can figure out how to not do it the next time. So that is a critical thing to keep track of. This pretty much covers everything you can check and everything there is to know about the Nano Osmolator and common troubleshooting and issues. It's a product that's been around now almost 12 years. It's fairly proven. It was never designed to be a top-of-the-line ATO system. The Osmolator and now the Osmolator 3 take that place. This was just designed to be an economical, simple solution for smaller aquariums. And I'd really like to emphasize that because, one of the things I see that is quite puzzling is people trying to adapt this to 100-gallon systems. An ATO is a very important part of an aquarium system. It needs to be reliable, it can't flood your tank, it needs to keep the osmotic gradient proper. That's where the name Osmolator comes from. It's a contraction of osmotic regulator. And what that means is keeping the salt level correct so that the animals in the tank aren't shocked by this fluctuation in salinity, and it needs to be a good, reliable system. And how good of a system you need is largely going to be proportional to how much you have invested in your aquarium. In a perfect world, everybody would buy the best one, but if you have a little basic starter Nano, maybe you can't justify spending a couple $100 for an ATO. But if you have a 100-gallon system, that's the price of a couple of corals, and you really should be buying the Osmolator instead of trying to make do with the Nano Osmolator and finagle some system with a small chamber. It just doesn't make sense. But for its purpose, running a little desktop Nano or a very simple system, starter system, it works very well. You just have to understand the product and how it works, and think of it like a gremlin. Never get it wet, because if you get it wet, it's going to be ruined. That tends to be one of the main failures we see. It is an old product. It will be updated very soon. So I just wanted to make this video because there's a lot of them out there, and hopefully we can keep people running the product as long as it can last, and then when it's time to upgrade, should have a new one fairly soon, and I'll cover that when it comes out. Thank you.